Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Megan Glova. A new poll from Meredith College finds the majority of North Carolina voters approve the use of the U.S. military to arrest and deport undocumented immigrants. Joining us now to break it all down is WRAL Capitol Bureau Chief Laura Leslie.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So what are some of your key takeaways from this poll?
I think, I talked to Meredith Poll director, that's David McLennan, an expert you hear a lot on our airways. And he was really surprised by how high that number was. 60% of people would support using the military for deporting, to arrest and deport, not just support, but actually like active law enforcement, right? Which is, very high, much higher than he expected it to be. And I think what you see, that this is not just Republicans. This is actually happening among Democrats and unaffiliated voters as well. It doesn't have majority support among those groups, but it has pretty high support among those groups.
Yeah.
So, so this is something that we're seeing as sort of a cultural shift. He thinks this probably has to do with this past election and kind of the way that the rhetoric was around immigration. The fear appeal, I think, is the word that he used. It may have motivated some people to feel a little differently about things.
That makes sense. And do we have specific numbers on how Democrats and Republicans compared in this polling?
Well, yeah. So for example, using the question about military use, 80% of Republicans would be in favor of using that. 44% of Democrats and 46% of unaffiliateds for that one. But, when we asked about other issues around deportation and undocumented immigrants, there was 85% support, right, for deporting undocumented immigrants who have criminal records. And I don't think that's a big surprise to anybody, right?
Sure.
I don't think there's a lot of people who disagree on that one. But there's a 54% support for deporting undocumented immigrants that do not have criminal records.
Wow.
And that's higher than he's seen in some previous polls that he's done.
And this pledge of deportation made by Trump, it does raise some legal questions from what I understand. Can we kind of dive into those, what some of those concerns may be?
Sure. So there's a law in the books called the Posse Comitatus Act. And basically what that does is it doesn't ban the use altogether of the military for active law enforcement domestically, but it does restrict it sharply. Like it sets some ground rules about what you can and you can't use military for. And so they try to keep the military and law enforcement apart, right, separate. And a lot of the military, according to some experts I talked to today, agree with that, right? They don't want to necessarily be law enforcement officers. That's not what they're trained for, and that's not what their mission is, right? But there are ways to get around that. For example, the Insurrection Act. That is something that can be invoked, and it was invoked. In the past, it was used by, for example, Dwight Eisenhower used it when he called out the military to help with the civil strife that was going on over school desegregation. For one example, there's also, Trump has mentioned the Alien and Sedition Acts, which is way back there in the 1700s. And that was used to inter the Japanese Americans in World War II. But that one usually it has to involve a threat from a foreign government. So that might be a little harder to make fit to this situation.
And of course, right now, this is a timely poll because this is such a hot topic of discussion post-election. But do we have any previous polling to compare these numbers to?
Well, we don't have apples to apples because we haven't asked these exact questions before because this isn't our poll. This is the Meredith poll, right?
Yeah.
But I will tell you that the director told me that he has seen, for example, support for building the wall, finishing the wall on the southern border among Democrats higher than he's ever seen it.
Okay.
And he's just seen, growing support among Democrats where that support wasn't necessarily there before. And so he really thinks and another expert I talked to today as well kind of said the same thing, that people are starting to, more Democrats and more unaffiliated voters are starting to perceive immigration the way that Republicans perceive it, which is more likely to be as a threat to national security. And that also explains why they might be more okay with having the military intervene to help, because the researcher I spoke to, Lindsay Cohn, said the research that she's done on this exact topic, domestic use of military force, is that people are generally okay with it if it's a threat.
Right. And again, the rhetoric might have played a huge role in that just from the campaign this year.
Sure.
And the poll also touched on two more points, tariffs and trade and trust in news sources. If we could dive into tariffs and trade first, that's of course been a big talking point since Trump was elected. How do those polled feel about the use of tariffs?
Well, it depends, right? People basically, what the poll shows is basically people like the idea of tariffs, right? They're a very popular idea. 66% would support using them in a trade war, for example, to retaliate against another country maybe who had tariffs, right?
Yeah.
A majority would support using them to encourage people to buy more American products, right? But when the poll asked the people, said real basically, if you want to buy a pair of jeans and that pair of jeans costs $10 more because of a tariff on the pair of jeans, is that okay?
You're
you
not
want to
gonna
pay
like
that $10?
probably.
And only 20% of people said they'd be willing to pay the extra money. 62% said no. So when the rubber meets the road, when it's down to your pocketbook, people feel a little bit differently about how tariffs work.
That's when it's not so appealing. And how about those trust in news sources? Did this focus on local or national sources? What did those numbers look like?
This was focusing mostly on where people get their political news.
Okay.
And I think it's not a big surprise that cable news was the number one. But it's very fractured. I mean, cable news was the number one, but it's 38%. Right? It's just a little over a third of people. And that covers all the channels from Fox, MSNBC, CNN, all of it, right?
Yeah.
What was really surprising to the poll director, David McLennan, was that social media was at 33%. 1/3 of people are getting their political news from social media. And here's the punchline. They don't believe what they're reading.
But they're still reading it.
But they're still reading it, right? That's the question you wish you could ask folks. But yeah, it is, as he put it, it's the ultimate irony, right? They're turning more and more to social media, but yet they say that social media cannot be trusted. They don't think it's trustworthy at all. The most trusted sources of information for political news were family and friends. 69% of people trusted them.
Okay.
Right, and then local news got 62%. Yay, us.
Yay.
National news, including cable news, was just 55% reliable. And only 38% said they trust what they see on social media.
Wow.
So they turn more and more to the things that they trust less and less. And that we wonder why we have problems with disinformation and misinformation, right?
Yeah, sure thing. Any other points that stood out to you in this polling? Anything that was unexpected or that just kind of caught your eye?
I think it was interesting that because one of the questions that they asked is, were you satisfied with how the elections were run? And you remember in 2020, that was a very, very loaded question, right? There was a lot of talk about allegations of fraud, allegations of vote stealing, et cetera. We did not see that this year, and you can see that reflected in the poll numbers because people, obviously there's a partisan split. A lot of Democrats are not happy about how things went, and a lot of Republicans are. But even overall, even the unaffiliated voters are just glad it's over. I think that's really the punchline here. Everybody's just sort of like, okay, move on.
Right. All right. Laura, thanks so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening to the WRAL Daily Download. You can find more podcasts from WRAL News at WRAL.com. Search podcast. From sports to true crime, there are plenty of shows to keep you informed and entertained. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.